Good morning, everyone. I'm Lakeith Campbell, for those that maybe weren't with us yesterday. I am your MC for the inaugural Power of Color event. So thank you so much for being here today. It's good to see returning and new smiling faces. So it's going to be another amazing day. Yesterday, for the first day of a symposium of its kind, they really knocked it out of the park. And it's only going to get better. They had some amazing speakers that showed up here in Atlanta, but also from around the world. And I don't think people were ready for the caliber. And I told people right up front, I'm like, you do not understand who you're going to see today. And it lived up to the hype, I promise you. So it's going to be the same thing today. I have to say, I've never been to Clark Atlanta, and I don't know how. I have family that works for Spelman and Morehouse. My mama went to Hampton, my auntie went to Howard, so you can imagine what things are like in the house. It's, holidays are really challenging, but I've never been on Clark Atlanta, and I have to say this is a beautiful campus. I'm also going to say this is the best campus food I've ever had. These students are very lucky. So every meal I've had has been awesome. But thank you again to the staff and the students, those of you that are crewing today and yesterday. Thank you so much. I know it has not been easy. We're a very technical group, and there's a lot of technical things that have to occur, and these students have really, they've really excelled and just kind of rolled with the punches. So if you could just give them a round of applause for all of that. So I'd also like to say thank you to Telestream, who is our live stream provider on their Sherpa platform. And again, I just want to say thank you to the small but mighty Symposium staff that has put this all together. It takes a lot of work to put together a symposium of this caliber. So with that said, Symposium President Renard Jenkins will start us off today with a recap of day one. Renard. But before Renard starts the wrap up, good morning, Renard.
Pause.
Yeah. Did you? I'm gonna walk away, but before I walk away, I'm gonna ask him to start off with a certain question. I'd love to gain more insight into the impact that color has had on your worldview in regards to visual content.
Okay.
So can you just share some examples of content that has made a lasting impression on you?
Okay. All right. I think one of the first pieces of content where I really focused on color, just in general, was probably Wizard of Oz. The Wizard of Oz, that moment where they go from being in black and white to transitioning to color, and all of a sudden you see this wonderfully beautiful, vibrant environment around the central character, and how they then use that to be the driving force through the movie of taking you down the yellow brick road. And you notice how the plants are coming alive with color, and they called it Technicolor back then, and it was really, really just this explosion, and that was a really big thing. So that was probably the first thing that really caught my eye. And it may just be nostalgia because I remember watching that with my mother and my grandmother and my uncles and aunts. That was sort of a family viewing thing. Then as you could tell from yesterday afternoon, I have a love for animation. So animation for me was also a way to start to tell, stories with color. And I enjoyed looking at that. But I think, if I look at more modern time, I think the way that they did the movie Traffic and the way that they separated the storylines through the use of color and how they did that, both within the way that they separated the storylines, you could also see how they brought either vibrancy or clearness to the characters within that color space that they were actually using. So, when Don Cheadle's character, who was sort of the central thread through the whole thing, would come in, he was extremely well lit, but he was still within whatever the hue color for that particular story was. So I thought that was pretty interesting as well. So yeah, that's a good way to get me started in the morning. Good morning, everybody. I am pleased to be here. And I do want to thank the wonderful staff of CAU. I do have history with this campus. I was here back in the late 80s and early 90s when we were starting to sort of get the production and the film industry to take notice of Atlanta. So we spent a lot of time shooting music videos on this campus and shooting documentaries and shorts on this campus and just really creating that film community that has taken off. A lot of the people that you saw yesterday also were here with us during that time, and it was during homecoming. Met my wife here. She is a Spelmanite, and if I do not tell people that when I'm in Atlanta, I'll hear about it when I get home. So yes, my dearest friends, one went to Morehouse and one is a Clark Atlanta graduate. So I have very, very deep roots here, and I spent 16 and a half years of my life as well as my career in this particular city. So it is good to come home. I married an East Coast girl, and I will never be able to go back to Oakland, California, but I guess Atlanta will have to be as close as I get to a second home. With that, I do want to thank Dr. Bentley for all of his support and all of the work with the students that he has been doing. We are proud to call Clark Atlanta University our first historically Black college student section of the Society of Motion Picture and Television Engineers. And this is just the beginning. We're excited about that. I am excited with the fact that this spawned out of a conversation with Dr. Graves and Dr. Bentley, and then the support that the school put around all of that to make us feel welcome, and then to begin to get us students and so forth. And speaking of the students, I want to thank all of the student volunteers that you see around you from CAU Television, as well as their professor, Brian Jenkins, who we are still trying to figure out how we are related, but we do believe that we are related. So with that, let's jump into some of the wonderful things that happened yesterday. So if you weren't here yesterday, you really did miss a treat. And you missed a treat because at the beginning of the day, we really talked about the why, and really why representation is important, and representation of hues and ethnicity. But also, I like the way that Dr. Calloway Thomas looked at it, in the sense of what matters most to you in how you are represented, and how to take difficult conversations, or they really don't have to be difficult if you look at it from the right angle, and use that as a way to educate and a way to enlighten not just the people with whom you're communicating and engaging, but also enlighten yourself as you understand more about different cultures and the way that operates. And when she placed herself in China and the situation that she described around what happened, I think it's very interesting that not only was it coming from a place of curiosity, which is what we all should be when we're looking at this from a scientific manner, but it was also coming from a place of enlightenment for both parties. And I thought that was really, really one of those things that stood out from that moment. And then we had Alfred Sama, who actually walked us through why representation matters, and he took us all the way back to pre-social media. The days before your feed was the most important thing that you looked at every single day to figure out if you can get that dopamine rush of somebody saying they like something that you said or something that you didn't. I thought it was really interesting when he was told, social doesn't matter. That's not going to be a big thing. Don't really worry about trying to, play in that space. And then he was able to turn that around, and he took his company and joined on with Gymshark, which is one of the largest athletic companies in the world right now, but it's number one or number two in the UK. And he was able to join with them and take their brand and push it to the second place next to Nike as far as influence and representation in the social media world. And he was able to do that over a number of years, but he was able to do it because he believed that if I can represent properly for individuals who are not seen, individuals who are not heard, individuals who may not be thought of, if I can represent properly to show you that this is a viable part of your business, then this will matter. And for him to do that and then show us this journey that he took to get there, I thought that was a wonderful way to set the stage for why it matters and how we represent the imagery around everyone and how we start to get down that road. So after we did that, we had a conversation with Darius Evans and Saxton Moore. Like I said, I have a love for animation. So we started off our sort of animation journey that day with them talking about representation of imagery in the space of animation and giving us an idea of where it is today. And so they talked about things I remember, like when the Harlem Globetrotters were guest stars on Scooby-Doo. And that was the first time that it was like, oh, wait, I can see the Harlem Globetrotters and their cartoon characters. For me, one of them that they didn't mention, which was one of my favorites, was the Jackson 5 cartoon. Because that was another one that was there during that time. So you had that opportunity. But they did hit on probably one that was the most influential at that time if you were a little boy or a little girl of color, which was Fat Albert. Now, you watched The Cosby Show every Saturday to see the Fat Albert cartoons that were interspersed with a lesson that was going to be taught for that particular day. And you know, when you think about it, they were not only representing us in a positive manner, but they also taught us how to laugh a little bit about some of the things that we go through. I still remember the joke where they say, Rudy, you're like a kid in summer school, and he looks and he says, what? And he say, no class. And that was like the funniest thing ever to us as kids. Like, okay, it is the cheesiest, corniest joke now, but it was the funniest thing when you're like 5, 6 years old. So that was really cool to see what they talked about historically. But what was even better was that Saxton took the opportunity to show us all of this just dynamic content that's now coming out right now. And you hear about, streamers aren't doing this, they're cutting content, they're doing all these different things. But what Saxton was showing us was that there is a plethora of content that is looking across the diaspora of every ethnicity for animation. And I thought that was just amazing to see what was happening. Then we took a little break. And we came back, and in the afternoon, we said, okay, we've talked about the why. Now let's show you how to begin to represent these images in a accurate light. And I use the term light as a pun right there because we had Christian Epps join us. And Christian Epps and I, like I said, we shot a lot of videos, a lot of movies, and a lot of documentaries in Atlanta back in the day. So Christian and I know this campus well. We know Atlanta well. We know where to get things done. So having him here, he is in LA now. And Christian, he has lit for, almost everybody when you think about the top entertainers in this world. He was on tour with Michael Jackson. He has lit shows for Whitney Houston. He has worked with Spike Lee. He has worked with Ernest Dickerson. He did Broadway as well as film. He has done just amazing work across the world. He spends probably about 6 months out of the year in Africa, either teaching or working on projects there right now. That's a yearly thing, and he's been doing it for about 20 years. one of the most requested lighting directors and gaffers in the business right now. He was instrumental in the look that was achieved for Selma. He was also primarily the look for what was done with Sylvie's Love. So he has done amazing work. And having him here, we talked a little bit about his career, and it was kind of strange for me because we are friends and we talk all the time, but I had to act like a moderator. But it was really cool to have a moment to dive into that. But what was even better is that we had a bunch of lighting gear and we got the audience involved, and we were able to actually show you how to think about light, to think about imagery, to think about shadow, and to think about how that darkness, that brightness, the luminance, all of that has to play together. And then he had a few guests with Justin and Brad who came on, Brad being a lighting director who has worked on a number of major films. He gave us his input and showed us some examples of his work. And then Brad came to us from an engineering standpoint from Canada and what they do at the CBC to make sure that everyone is represented in the best light from an image standpoint with what the work that they do from the production standpoint. That was great. And that was a 90-minute session where we had people moving around, lights and things. It was really engaging. I was really, really excited about that one. And then it was sort of like my friends programming in the afternoon. So we then had Keith White of Afro Animation and Kwame Nyong'o, who is a professor at the Savannah College of Art and Design. Kwame is professor of animation, and he took us through an illustrated history of representation of people of color in animation. And he took us all the way back to hieroglyphics on the Egyptian scrolls. And he talked about how the use of shading and lighting in that sense was used to emote. And then he showed how some of the scrolls have different, same characters, but different positions, which was the beginning of animation and the idea of how these animated images could then look as if they were moving. Then he took us through some of the more modern things, cycloscopes and things of that nature. And then he brought us all the way up to modern day and how we are now looking at 2D and 3D and how those things are coming together, but how lighting and shading still remains important for us to be able to represent people of all hues. And then Keith spent time walking us through why it is important to have a community, to understand that having a community that you can relate to when it comes to your particular vertical. If it's animation, having Afro Animation as a place where you can come and learn, and then a place where people can learn about you. And you can then work with major studios, work with major companies, work with small boutiques that also need the work, but then they focus on areas that are adjacent to animation that can still use the work that you do, whether it is technical illustration or whether it is something in marketing or something in advertising. So he worked what they do there and then told us, well, the next Afro Animation is happening in Burbank in April. And then we viewed the movie Merimi. And Merimi is a Nigerian folktale that was brought to life as part of the Disney Kazazi Moto anthology. And we, excuse me, and we were lucky enough to have Shofela Coker and Ingrid De Beer. Shofela is the illustrator and director of the movie, and Ingrid is the producer and technologist who works for Lucan TV out of South Africa. And Ingrid flew in that morning, or yesterday morning, got off a plane from South Africa. Shofela picked her up and brought her here, and she stayed awake to be able to give us a wonderful idea of the workflows and the technical processes that they put in place. But Shofela, being a native Nigerian, wanting to make sure that his film was done on the continent of Africa and then being paired as part of the Disney process with Lucan TV. They talked about how that relationship bore out this wonderful content and how they have now really begun to start to feel out what they can do next. But they also showed how you can take music to help punctuate the images and to punctuate the light and the sound and bringing it together to show how you can move a story forward with animation. So that was great. And it was a real treat for us to be able to view the movie here as a screening. And I do want to thank the members of Walt Disney Company for allowing us to do that. If you have never worked with them, I can tell you it is a feat to get through their process to work with them and to allow them, because as they should be, they are very protective of their intellectual property. And to be honest, we all should be. And so I do want to thank the Disney Company for allowing us to do that here on this campus and allowing the filmmakers to be here with us to walk us through. And then we ended the day with another friend of mine. She was coming in from Australia, and her name is Lynn Tam. And Lynn, like me, is a technologist. She is an engineer. She is, but we both started out on the creative side. And she has returned to her creative roots. During the pandemic, she talked about the desire to need to move things and to get back to what actually mattered to her. And she stated very clearly, she said that too often we wait for someone to give us permission to do something. But if you want to do something, go do it. Do not wait for permission, go do it. So here it is, an engineer and a technologist who said, I'm going to make my animated film. She started taking classes on the weekend on writing and so forth. She wrote her film. And it's a wonderful story because the film is about friendship through a lifetime. 6-minute film that has been critically acclaimed as an animated short, and it is award-winning and has won numerous festivals. So she came in to talk to us about her journey and where she is and how she got to where she is today. And it was really wonderful for her to talk about how she wants Asian representation in animation to go beyond martial arts or having special powers. And she talked about how she wanted her characters to represent life as it is for people of Asian descent. And so she brought that into the journey and showed us what she did. And one of the things that I enjoyed about her film is that there were subtle things that she did with the shading of the skin of the two major characters. Throughout the film, you notice a slight change as they age. And as all of us know, as we age, our skin does change. But to take that into account and to begin to pour that into an animated short, that alone was really one of those simple little things that makes a huge difference in the way that you view images that are supposed to represent you. And I thought that was just amazing that she took the time to do that. And I also thought it was amazing that Saxton brought up the fact that when animating characters who are of African descent, making sure that he showed the dark side of their hand, but also the light side. And if you look at animations that came before what they've been doing with Lightforge and what he did there, you won't see that. And it's something that we just overlooked because we were so used to the way that it was represented. But that is a way of bringing life to these characters and bringing in what we do. So with that, I got to tell you, we had a wonderful day yesterday. I enjoyed interacting with the students. I enjoyed the questions from the audience. I really enjoyed the questions from the audience. So we want you to ask questions when we say Q&A. So take notes. I'm not going to say there will be a quiz, but Dr. Bentley is here. There could be a quiz. You may get a mark on your permanent record if you don't answer correctly. but enjoy the day. Take care, everybody, and thank you so much for representing and being here with us.
Thank you, President Renard Jenkins. And so it was day one. And so we shall truly begin day two with another amazing speaker. Yesterday, my opening statement, I said this: you cannot be intrinsically part of the whole experience if you can't trust what you're looking at. And our next presenter is using her love of math, science, and creative technology to contribute positively to this truth. Catherine Mininger is a color scientist with portrait displays. Her research focus is color science and psychophysics. Her research covers human color perception as it relates to modern displays. She earned a BS degree in motion picture science from Rochester Institute of Technology and was actively involved in RIT SMPTE student chapter and served as its president. Today she'll be providing us an introductory primer into color science and how it applies to color management and media content. So please welcome Catherine Mininger to the stage with all the light and attention she deserves. Catherine, get ready. What?
All right, good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. So in today's Power of Color Workflow session, I want to make sure that we're taking everyone through this journey of what color science means and how we're using that to apply to our media technology today. So in my first session, I want to kind of dip your toes into the water of what we mean by color science and how we apply that to managing color across our media. And then in our following sessions, we'll get a little bit deeper into the topics, talking to some very talented colorists about what their experiences are, and then hearing from researchers who are maybe not traditionally located within our industry, but can provide some insights. So I hope that everyone, regardless of if you are very familiar with color science and color management, or if you're just getting started, I hope you're able to take something away from today's session. So let's go ahead and get started with our intro to color management. So where this is coming from, I am one of the leads on the RIS, Rapid Industry Solutions Color Management Working Group. So what this working group is it's a part of this overall initiative related to on-set virtual production that SMPTE put together a couple of years ago. And so in the color management working group, we are looking at what are the current problems that the industry is facing today in this modern technology. But the first step that we came into when we started talking about what are we going to do, what is our group charter, is acknowledging that phrasing in color science and color management, there can be confusion. And there's buzzwords that people use, and are we using them properly? Are we speaking the same language? So our first initiative in that group is to do kind of an intro to color management, kind of laying the land, making sure that we're all speaking the same language. So whether you're a scientist like me, a colorist, or you may be on an executive staff or a creative, we all start to understand what we're talking about and can better communicate with one another. So coming up in the next few months, you'll be seeing a report coming out of this color management working group that is targeted specifically towards on-set virtual production. But today I kind of want to take that a step back and talk about what color management is in general. And one of the things that we want to make sure is our goal here is not to try to make everyone a color scientist. I really enjoyed this analogy that we've been using in the working group of when we talk about color science, there's a huge iceberg underneath what you are experiencing and what you're able to see and how media technology works today. And so when you first start learning these terms, we then say that that might make you enough to be dangerous. You start to see these knobs and you know what to touch. And perhaps there needs to be some more understanding of how to properly use those, or what are best practices, I should say, to use them. So we just want to get you under the water and give you that introduction. Our goal here is not to make everyone a color science and go down to a PhD level where some of us are, unless you are so inspired and you would like to join us in our small little world there of color scientists. So let's start by first defining what exactly we mean by color management. I took some Googling just to see what other people out there think about what color management means. So I want to go ahead and share some of these with you and give you my personal thoughts on them. So one definition that I found was that color management is the technology related to the correct interpretation and rendering of color information. That seems like an okay definition. Then we also have a process where the color characteristics for every device in the imaging chain is known precisely and utilized in color reproduction. I think that's getting a little more specific into the technicalities of what color management is. We get to the process of ensuring consistent and accurate colors across various devices, such as monitors, printers, and cameras, which I think when most people think about color management, that's what they imagine, that we are trying to make sure that whether you are on a mastering device in your color studio, you're watching in a theater, or on your television at home, that the color there is being represented in the way that it was intended. But my personal favorite definition, and the one that I really want to hammer home today, is that color management is the use of appropriate hardware, software, and methodology to control and adjust color in an imaging system. And the reason why I like that definition is because it helps communicate that there isn't always a correct way or a right way to do color and to do color management. This is simply a tool to allow you to be an artist and to be creative. And so all that really matters at the end of the day is that the image that you're seeing on screen is the image that you want to see. It doesn't matter if it's colorimetrically correct, if we're talking about skin tones, that this is the exact color that's appearing on your screen. Is it the image I want to convey and the message I want to convey? And so today's themes are going to center around that topic and what I want you to think about when we're talking about color management. So the other two are, I think, appropriate. And I think there's still value in recognizing that once someone does create that picture, we do want that picture to be communicated across to the community. So it's a combination of those two things, and we will continue forward with that in mind. So when we're going through the process in production, what we're talking about, as I mentioned, taking an image that we capture on set, someone's working on it in some mastering environment, making it exactly the way they look, working with their clients and other creatives, to eventually get it to some presentation. So we've used color management to create that color and to make that look a certain way that we want it to. And then we also want to use color management to make sure that that picture is maintained throughout with the production workflow. But what has happened over time that used to be a more simple workflow, maybe where you know exactly what film stock you're using, or maybe you are in the broadcast environment and you're going direct from camera straight out to the signal. And so there isn't a lot of complexity there. But as technology has evolved, especially in the past few decades, we now have multiple cameras that can exist in a pipeline, which each have their own particular style of color rendering. How many people are working on it in many different places? You have multiple post houses, VFX, colorists, editors. They're all looking at the same picture on different screens in different places all over the globe. And the goal still is to bring that all together and then again distribute it all across the world. And the method of distribution has also changed, where we have theatrical, broadcast television, streaming. Everyone has so much more access to media. And that means a lot more access to different color devices and different ways that we need to make sure that image is being preserved. And then not to mention, we have SDR and HDR representations of all the same content. So as color management has evolved, the way we think about handling those systems has had to evolve with us. And why we want to think about that, let's see if it shows up nicely on this screen here. So that when we are trying to convey, let's say, something as important as our representation and our skin tones, it doesn't shift as we start inappropriately characterizing what devices it's intended on. So in these images, what I've attempted to demonstrate for you, and partly because I believe this LED wall here is probably not in the color gamut that the images are rendered for, you are seeing still an intentional perturbation of what these skin tones accurately look like. So before we get into the specifics of color management, I want to talk about where all of that comes from. And that starts with defining what color is and how we see color. So I wanted to give everyone a little bit of an introduction to human color perception and how we mathematically represent that in order to apply it to our image technology. So let's first talk about what properties of color are. Something that I always enjoyed when I was in school learning about color science is there can be an argument between people who study light physics and people who study color. And I think there's an agreement that without a human in the process, color does not exist. And it's important to remember that at the end of the day, this is all light, and this is all a phenomenon that we're all creating within the wonderful brains that we have. So in nature, light creates the color, and when we put it into a picture, then we have color creating the light that we see. It was a quote I found by Hans Hofmann. I thought it was a very interesting way to introduce this concept. So let's talk about how color exists in nature first. There exists some source of light out there in the world. Let's say we're talking about the sun. That's the one that we experience in our day-to-day without having to introduce any fancy technology in it. So sources are creating energy at specific wavelengths, and that wavelength is representing to us some meaning, and we'll get more into that as we talk more about this imaging chain. From there, you'll have some object, and that object has properties of transmission, absorption, reflectance. In the case of imaging technology, we're going to focus today mostly on those reflectance properties. So it's going to have some interaction with the light that is bouncing off of it, and the combination of those is what gives us the sensation of color from an object. So what I want to really highlight here is that all of this starts with the source of light. That's what things come from. Your object is going to stay consistent. That's always going to have its same reflective properties, but we can change its rendering and its appearance to you by manipulating the light that's going into it. So on a film set, maybe you're using a tungsten light. It has a very different distribution than what daylight may have. In tungsten in particular, it's giving you a bit of a warmer tone. So you can see that shift in energy output towards what we attribute to us as longer wavelengths in warmer colors. And so that's going to have a different rendering on our skin. So we're going to take away some of that distribution that maybe was there in the more blue and greens hues in those shorter wavelengths. And that's really going to emphasize the warmth that exists within our skin tones. Something that people have been doing very recently, especially as we're getting into things like virtual production, which the Color Management Working Group is focusing on, is LED lighting, which has a very, very different distribution. So when you look at an LED light, we can use that to simulate daylight or whatever other color temperatures that we're looking for. More on that here in a moment. But right, if we're talking about how it's interacting with an object, we are going to get that same spectra back. So what I want to highlight here in this moment is noticing the lack of contribution from certain wavelengths that would presently be there in some of the other examples. The most notably being in those yellows and oranges, which if we look around a room or if we look at our own skin tones, we know that there's some contribution there. So what you will tend to see in images, if you're choosing to light someone using an LED technology, you're going to highlight and pick up a lot more of that red coloring, and it tends to shift our colors in a way that some may call undesirable. Maybe you like it. Again, color is up to your preference, but it is important to recognize what light am I choosing and how is that going to change the properties of the object I'm illuminating? And then ultimately, what is that going to be intended for? So in this section, let's talk about how that's intended for the human eye and how we turn what up to this point, we've just talked about light as it exists physically. Now we need to turn that into a perceptual phenomenon. So here's where we get into a little bit more color science. I'm going to try not to speak a lot of math at you, but I do want you to understand maybe some of the terms and languages that we will use later in our conversations. So how color is produced is through detection of these specific wavelengths in our eye. What we have are cones that are sensitive to short, medium, and long wavelengths, and that's how we associate those typically with red, green, and blue colors. So that's where we're going to see that principle designed around, since that mimics closely to how humans see, and where we're designing imaging systems, we're thinking about a human in the process, and the human is what we're actually going to be looking at. But when we are talking about color in color management and trying to communicate in color science, we have created something called the XYZ color space, where XYZ is another way that we have measured what the output stimulus is from our human visual system. So rather than trying to focus on the exact biology, we've created a mathematically convenient way to talk about this color perception. And then from XYZ, we convert that into other representations to talk about different attributes of color. So here's just a quick highlight. We're going to go into these in a little bit more detail of what some of these example color spaces are. We have chromaticity diagrams and other color spaces that start to talk more about perceptual qualities. So each of these different color spaces gives us different information about what the quality of a color is, and then how we're going to talk about it and communicate that information. One that you see very common when we talk about color management or color media is XY chromaticity. XY chromaticity is a way that we use to describe color in a 2D representation called a chromaticity diagram. And what I want to highlight, I want to spend a little bit of time on this diagram because it's probably the one that you see the most often in color management and what you're talking about. So what you see as the overall big horseshoe shape is called the spectral locus. That contains the entirety of human color vision. So if you were to look around the outside perimeter, that contains those unique wavelengths of detection from our eyes. And then the line that connects red and blue is called the line of purples. And it's actually my favorite portion of this diagram because it means that those are the colors that don't physically exist. They are what we create just by our human color vision. People always ask me as a color scientist, what's your favorite color? And I'll say purple. And then I'll say, because purple's not a real color. At least it's not one that exists physically. So that's how we create the scope of what colors exist for a system. Our human vision is a system in itself. And so by extension, we can use that to describe other imaging technologies in a color gamut. So for example, what you see on this plot right now is a Rec 709 color gamut. We'll talk a lot more about what those standards mean later, but that shows what colors a device can reproduce in the context of what a human is going to see. So we tend to use this diagram a lot to try to communicate device capabilities and what your range of color reproduction can be. Extended from that, you may also see something called the U prime V prime chromaticity plot. It's very important in a mathematical perspective that we try to think about things in a simple math, being able to do linear algebra and not having to do a lot of complicated equations, and also relate that to perception. So there's an idea that if I have so much distance in a mathematical space, that should relate to what a similar distance is in terms of a difference in my vision. So this was the first attempt at trying to create a space like that where things are supposed to be more what we call perceptually uniform in a mathematical sense. And it also begins to allow us to see some of those linear algebra properties and linear mathematics that exist within our display applications. Just touching a little bit on things that maybe you don't see a lot in color management, but I think are important to highlight as we talk about how we communicate color. There's the C-Lab color space, which becomes another perceptually uniform color space. I have some quotation marks there because I've done a lot of research on what the space is and what it actually represents. But as before I talked, we perceive color with those cones, but how we actually process color is through what we call color opponency. So I'm detecting differences between light and dark. That gives me my intensity. And then there's color differences between red and green and blue and yellow. And so your sensation of vision as it's processed through the rest of your brain relies on that color opponency difference, rather than thinking of red, green, and blue as individual components. In the C-Lab color space, we start to take into account how our visual system adapts to the environment around us. If you are here in this environment and look around, something will look white to you. If you go outside into daylight, it'll take you a little bit of time. Things may look strange, but eventually it all normalizes out as your sensitivities adjust. So we attempt to account for that as well in these perceptual spaces, because at the end of the day, when you are adapted to that and you have the proper light source, what is blue under one source, for example, will still look blue under another source to you, even if that light source has different color qualities. A more recent color space, and by recent, it's probably lots of years are passing by since I graduated college and I forget, is the ICTCP color space. This is one that tries to accomplish a similar goal to C-Lab, but designed with HDR technology in mind. So C-Lab worked well for us when we had SDR, we had lower luminance ranges, and it pretty much closely related to how we see color in reality and how we're perceiving it in color reproduction. ICTCP attempts to account for more nuances and how that changes based on if you're looking at something that is 700 nits or 1,000 nits. It also addresses some of the problems that exist in C-Lab. If you're very curious on looking at what those differences are, there's another research paper that we gave at Symposium a few years ago that talks about those differences. That's a whole other 30-minute presentation, so we're not going to go too deep into that today. But I do want you to know that this is another color space that exists, and it speaks a similar language of color opponency. And then the last color space I wanted to touch on is the LCH, or you may call it ICH if you're using ICTCP. Both are appropriate for this space, where it turns into a language that maybe we all speak a little bit differently if you're not a color scientist. We get into chroma and hue, which speaks similarly to what saturation is, and then how you attribute the differences between a red, a green, a blue, a yellow. So when you're trying to talk about a specific color or qualities of that color, this becomes more similar to maybe what the average language is where we're trying to communicate. So that starts to talk about all of the mathematical representations and how we convey information about color back and forth. And the main takeaway I want you to have from what we covered in that section is that human color perception is in and of itself an imaging chain, and that is what has inspired color technology going into the future. So there's 3 phases that I like to separate this into. There's a stimuli phase. So that is simply the physical properties that we covered in the beginning of the interactions between a light source and an object's reflectance properties. The capture and prepare stage, which talks about how light gets from that object through whatever detector you have. In this instance, we're talking about our eyes. And then into a presentation, which if you think about it from a human visual perspective, you're not necessarily seeing something somewhere, but your brain is presenting a sensation for you. So that's where I like to liken that perception to for the human color perception part of an imaging chain. So that covers the basics I wanted to capture for human color perception. That's going to provide the foundation as we get into color systems moving forward. So let's talk about how, if we introduce different color imaging applications into this, how it changes. So let's continue our stimuli that we have. This is the one particular from a tungsten source. But instead of a human eye in place, we're going to add a camera. And as a camera will function not like an eye, but again, it's being designed because at the end of the day, it's being intended for a human to look at it. So you will have a spectral sensitivity, which is at the end of the day what we were focusing on for our human color perception. And cameras will also have a red, green, or blue sensitivity akin to short, medium, and long wavelength detection. The way that sensitivity is designed is going to be unique for every device, whether that is a film stock that is trying to interact with light and absorb that interaction, or if it's a digital sensor that has particular sensitivities to those wavelengths. Those are all going to be unique, and that's this capture stage on a color imaging system. Then we get into the processing and storage part, where that gets into how is that color information then communicated and encoded. And so in this instance, I'm using a digital representation in a 8-bit format. So wherever we've captured somewhere in that picture, we're going to have, in this instance, a RGB value. Again, how each camera works today is going to encode that a little differently, but that is going to be how we go from camera. And eventually, the end goal is to put that on a display, where if we start to connect the dots here, there's another light source, which means the imaging chain can start over again with a light source, a stimuli going into our eyes, and it all is interconnected. The important quality that I want to make sure to highlight on displays is the concept of metamerism, which basically means we can reproduce color and with any other spectra that we have. So if we have a red, a green, and a blue primary on a display, as we call them, we can combine those together to create the same sensation of color. So whether you're looking at it on a Rec 709 device or something that may have a P3 gamut, we know how to adjust the balance of those colors to still give you that same, if you refer back to, and like an XY chromaticity value. That is the ability and how we're able to base color management as we're talking about color reproduction and maintaining a creative intent. So as we talk about what that particular process is, we're going to get a little bit more technical here. And I want to highlight on that exact process when we get from camera to intermediate to final presentation. This is where, in post-production, color management, I believe, is really coming into play. So in a camera capture, our goal, especially in today, is not necessarily to produce a immediately viewable image. Our goal is to get as much information about the scene as possible, or get it in the way that's setting us up nicely for what we're intending later on in our rendering. So in this example, you'll have an image that doesn't look wonderful, but it should have a lot of information in it. So that then in the intermediate stage, we can take that into a working space. So we've transformed and adjusted that image so that we can apply color adjustments, transforms, whatever else we need to do in preparation for getting it to a final display where now you can actually intend to look at it. So as I was looking for inspiration from this and trying to combine how a color scientist may talk about it versus someone who's a more creative, understanding what stage in the process you're at and what kind of image you're looking at is very important. And a comment that was made, people will look at that intermediate picture maybe for a long time, especially if you're introduced to it first, and you'll start to like it because you're getting used to it. But that's not the image that is really intended for your final presentation. There's a lot more work that's going into that to make that proper for whatever display or film or projection that you're intending to see things on. So getting into the more technical side of that, what is changing here are those characteristics we've been touching on of what color can be captured and how is that color being encoded. So you will see terms, especially from a more scientific perspective, called transfer functions. In a camera, you'll have something called a optoelectronic transfer function. That's describing the process of taking optical light output and turning it into an electrical signal. So if you're working with cameras, you may see things like a log color space, or I shouldn't say color space, a log encoding, or some other nonlinear form of trying to capture that information. Maybe it's camera raw. Those are all different ways of trying to capture that information in the scene and store that in an efficient way, because especially if we're talking about digital color, there's only so much space that we can put on there. We want to make sure to make as much use of that as possible. When we go into an intermediate stage, we want to make sure that we're applying transforms in a way that is representative either of light in that scene or making sure that we're taking advantage of that logarithmic encoding that may be coming from our camera. So we want to get into that space where then we can turn that into whatever we want. Regardless of what stage you're at in a imaging color management system, there's going to be a linear effect that happens because that is where our color transforms will take place. You need to be in a linear mathematical space in order to properly apply those kind of mathematics because the representation of light as it exists in a scene is linearly based. And finally, once we've gotten to that, we have to do all of this other encoding again so that when it hits a display, it's rendered in the way that we want it to intend. And the part that I think is important to keep in mind here is that there's all of these small transforms that are happening, but the big picture is what we are referring now to as the optical transfer function, the OOTF, which really just summarizes the rendering intent. So if there is a particular flavor of encoding you like from a camera because it's giving you a particular feel, that may be something we want to carry all the way through in the final intent. And it's not always to say that the OETF at the beginning of the chain directly is the inverse of the EOTF at the very end of the chain. We want to make sure that that creative intent and whatever you're intending to show up in your image is properly reflected. And that is the important part, I think, of working with color management. And what helps you identify what am I looking at, what do I need to do to this, is being able to understand what does this color value mean in the image I'm working with. And the two things that I think are important to really highlight are what is that device color space that I'm working in, and what is that transfer function that something currently exists. Usually if you know these two characteristics, that can get you in and out of whatever space you need to be in so that you can apply whatever transforms or creative adjustments that you're wanting to make in a space that works well for you. So just to highlight, for example, on the top diagram here, I have a chromaticity plot, which hopefully now is becoming a little bit more familiar, with various color gamuts. Some of them are display color gamuts, and one that I want to make sure I don't describe as a color gamut is a different system of encoding, because what we're doing, right, is math underneath and trying to do processing of information in a way that allows us to accommodate a wide variety of technologies. So for example, I have on here a ASIS color distribution. I'm trying to not use the word color gamut because these aren't necessarily gamuts. They're not a range of device capabilities. They're simply a way to communicate this color information and a way to store that information. So if you see on this red triangle here, it is extending way beyond what humans can see. And that doesn't mean that the color we've captured really exists out there or that that is what we're trying to physically represent. It means that that's a place we can go to allow us to get somewhere else. And that is simply just another mathematical representation and a tool to get what your creative vision is. So whenever you're seeing color management and you're needing to go from camera to a display or whatever else in between, think to yourself, what are these two characteristics and how am I going to move between them? And so that's how you get your color managed system. Now we have our varying cameras. We know what color space we may have encoded in. We know what we know what transfer function that information came from. We know where we're going to, what space we need to work in across our different environments, and we know where we're intending to go. So there's lots of these little transforms throughout a color management pipeline, but it helps make sure that whatever team is working on something really has a great understanding of what they're looking at and how to make sure that what you see in your color bay or what you see on your television at home is what everyone else is trying to see. So as we're reaching the end of time here, I want to highlight on a couple other aspects of color management. The first so we did all this math. How do I know I actually did it right? Do I just look at the picture and say, okay, I like that. That looks good. Maybe you can. Or we can take a more scientific, technical approach to really make sure that we did these things correctly. And so the two questions I asked there is, are the values that are in the image actually reflecting the space that I thought it should be in or the data that I thought it should be? And then, of course, because it's a human perception, is the color that I'm seeing on the screen actually the color that I'm supposed to see based on what that data is representing? And so how do we do that? SMPTE's bread and butter of test charts. So I have a variety of test charts here. And this is where a lot of our technical aspects come into play, whether that's verifying a color system or creating a color system. We, of course, have SMPTE bars, which are providing us a way to detect what color space am I in, and do I know I have that set up correctly. There's the version on the bottom from BT 21.1. I think I said that right, maybe enough ones. That's related more to an HDR workflow. And then a bunch of color patches here that we will use to understand how color is behaving across an entire device. And something in particular that I want to highlight as we look at these color patches is to ask yourself the question of, are we really accounting for all of the important colors that mean to us? And in particular, I want to comment a little bit on the Kodak image below. As you look at the history of imaging technology development, I think it's important to highlight who was in front of a camera and who we were considering in development of technology. And I want to appreciate that yesterday we had comments in presentations that the technology has gotten better and the ability to represent different colors has gotten better. Something that I want to convey, especially in my line of work, working with a lot of displays, is make sure we're still doing that and keeping in mind exactly that breadth of what representation means to people. It's a question that I would ask as you look at here. I think the important thing that I'll highlight in a later presentation today is, do I see myself reflected in these color tests? And is that going to show up in my color technology the way that we intended it to be? So jumping back into some technical discussions here, what are ways that we're looking at that data? The best way to look at it, and it's a little hard to see, I think, on this screen here, are charts and scopes that exist in technology. Not everyone is going to be a color scientist, and we don't want to trust our eyes. And we want an easy way to look at that data without having to crack open a file and look at the RGB values directly. So there's lots of great ways that we can see that data being presented in a way that makes sense to us visually. So the ones I want to highlight that I've seen a lot lately, we're starting to use chromaticity diagrams on displays and color editing systems that start to tell us this digital value is representing this chromaticity value of my imaging system. And you can start to use that information to say, okay, I know my red was supposed to be a 709 red, for example, but is that showing up somewhere else? That tells me I have something wonky going on in my color management process and I need to address that. There's some really cool charts out there where people have started to make specific shapes, like circles, or other things that you can quickly look at and evaluate, yes, everything's set up correctly, or no, it's not. So maybe as a color scientist, that's the one that I particularly like the most because it's one that I get to stare at all the time. Other ones, yesterday we were introduced to a vector scope for a little bit during one of our sessions. I wanted to highlight that as well, where a vector scope is designed to have certain colors in a certain place based on what your color encoding is. And then waveforms and parades to show what the distribution of code values are in a scene. So you have particular test patterns that are designed to be used in this way so that you can quickly get an analytic view of what your color management process is doing. And you can confirm without having to look at a bunch of different pictures or trust your eyes or take measurements if things are set up correctly. Here you can then say, okay, I know my data's right, so I can move forward from that sense. But again, it matters what color you're seeing. So you can have all the data set up in the world, and that could be fine, but if what you're looking at on the screen isn't actually reflective of what you're wanting to see, then that doesn't really matter. Because then the color that you created is not going to be the color that maybe someone else sees. So that is where the topic of display calibration and display analysis comes into play. That is my particular field that I spend a lot of time in. The ability to characterize how a display behaves and change that into an industry standard so that whatever display I'm looking at, the color is going to reproduce on that in the same way that it does on another device somewhere else in the world. And the analytical aspect to that is being able to convert, if we reach back to those color spaces we talked about, going from a numerical representation of XYZ into a value that starts to represent what that perceptual color difference is, which we refer to as a delta E. There's many different representations of a delta E. There's many different then interpretations of what that delta E can mean. There's another research paper that I've looked into before, since this is a topic very close to display calibration, of how do you interpret what delta E means and which one should you be using in what context. So I encourage you to read more about that and make sure that you understand the color space that you're working in so you can properly interpret what a color difference value in that space means to you. All right, so I think that gives us, again, a brief introduction into color management. There are so many hour-long topics you can go on about the specifics. There's some summarizations and generalizations in there, but I hope you can walk away from this being able to follow along in later conversations and understand how they can affect our media technology. But as a color scientist, what I can't also talk about in 45 minutes, I want to just quickly highlight to geek about a little bit so that if this topic interests you and color science interests you, here are some things you can continue following up on. And let's see if I can get this done here in just a couple minutes. So in particular for color science, new technology is creating new problems, and these are touching on some of the things that the Onset Virtual Production Color Management Group are looking into, as well as other color scientists around the globe are currently investigating as it relates to media technology. My particular field in display calibration is looking at modern display technology and how that's changing to create wider color gamuts and to create a wider variety of colors that exist within our human vision, and how to accomplish higher dynamic range. So by multi-primary displays, we're talking a lot about RGB. We're talking about adding other components in there, such as a white pixel that can create a white distribution, or cyan or yellow, something that's going to change that rendering of color as you see it and as it hits your eye. And displays are also getting very creative with their color processing. So depending on how much money you're willing to spend on a device, what kind of thought has gone into there and trying to still create that image, there's lots of crafty things that are going on in the world. And to that aspect, that's where I really want to highlight making sure that we're using good test charts and good development processes in our pipelines so that as we're getting crafty with these other color processing algorithms, that we're not negatively impacting creative intent and we're not negatively impacting rendering of color as we wish it to be. Some other things that I've been focusing on in my research are metameric failures with narrowband spectra. So if we talked about LED distributions and how they are much smaller and sharper and spread out compared to more broadband sources like tungsten, when we talk about displays such as LED displays being used in color volumes that are being captured by cameras, or just displays that we're looking at. That starts to pick up on those spectral sensitivity differences, whether that's in our eye as an observer or in a camera that has its own unique properties. And so we start to get different color captures of what the same color is, and that becomes a little bit more difficult to manage and understand, especially when that's happening in your eye. And we're starting to now see another color science question I'll get is the color red the same red that I see that you may see? Well, depending on what light source you're looking at, maybe not. So I thought it's a very fascinating topic that I've been looking into. And then, of course, wanting to highlight how all these modern technologies are changing virtual production workflows. And there's imaging chains on imaging chains being introduced. Every time you get a new light source introduced somewhere, you're starting to need to think about how is that changing my imaging chain and what's looking at it and what's eventually going to be presented at. And then finally, in the theme of the conference, I am by no means a great color science researcher in the field of skin reproduction, but there are many out there. And I want to make sure I highlight them. So if this topic is super interesting to you, here are some resources I really suggest reaching out to. Starting to look into the more human aspect, I think, of color rendering. So these are papers that are talking about not just how we are measuring color and describing color, skin color, I should say, but how do people actually want to be represented? And how do people prefer their skin color to be presented in images? There's lots of great research here that I really recommend reaching out to. And the thing I want to keep in mind to that aspect is that research really inclusive? When I look through some of these papers, I always ask myself, there are lots of pale patches here. And what cultures are we trying to represent? And are we underrepresenting certain groups within this process of developing algorithms and developing our imaging technologies? And so that's a little peek into one of our later sessions today with Dr. Monk that talks about that particular aspect. So with that being said, I think that will cover my primer on color management. I hope that we all have a decent base language to go on to as we continue into our next sessions. So I'll open up the floor if there are any questions, and then we'll continue on with our day. Yeah. Do we have a microphone?
We'll bring a mic to him. Oh.
Check, test. Who had a question?
Yeah.
First off, I want to say that was fantastic.
Thank you.
Outstanding work.
Thank you. Thank you.
So I have a unique position within SIMTI. I'm the chair of the James Lindner Archival Achievement Award. And the purpose of the award is to honor the person or persons that have come up with innovation towards technology workflow solutions for the preservation and access of motion pictures. 2 years ago, we had the honor of presenting this award to someone who you may know or know of her work, Barbara Flukiger. Mm-hmm. So Barbara Flukiger has been doing amazing research into what do colors represent within motion picture film, right? It becomes interesting. I think that from my understanding, it seems as though your presentation was really based more on video than motion picture film. It seems like the research really aligns more with color values within video, because what we start to see within motion picture film is a little bit different, and I think it's worth commenting on. So motion picture film is capturing image at red, green, blue. Film scanners are yellow, cyan, magenta. Those are not the same color values. I am delighted to share that the company I work with, which is owned by Jim Lindner, has created the rainbow. And the rainbow is basically, I think it's 10-band color equalizer. It's a multi-image spectral scanner. We were presenting it at the last SIMTI conference. Fortunately, James Snyder, who presented, there was a little bit of technical challenge. I don't know if you were there. but we have gotten the approval, and I can't go into this too much because there's numbers that haven't been provided yet, towards trying to fix and actually have the technology. Of course, the problem in it, and you kind of mentioned it in one of your slides, is the amount of data that it's going to create, all right? Because ultimately we're talking 10 times the amount of one film. Right. Am I right, though, in understanding what Barbara's been leading and what Jim Linda's been researching, that the values in relationship to video are closer, or is this still kind of like the same thing that we see in the motion picture film area? Is it that the cameras, I do know that the data wranglers have, in fact, I think the first time I saw that was during Avatar, right? I actually, it's the position is where, because all these digital cameras are creating different values, someone has to keep track of. So your presentation, am I right that it's basically on the video spectrum as compared to motion picture film spectrum?
Yeah, I will definitely say I come from a digital video background, so that's my personal flavor into this. And I do want to take the moment, I think it is appropriate to highlight there are differences in how film captures versus how a digital sensor may capture. Would love to chat about that more if I had another hour or so to talk about those specifics. But that's why I think the important part to really hammer is what we're talking about is light and color and those physics. And when you start to understand how is film dye interacting with light and storing that, and then how am I projecting through that to get a certain light output, that's what allows you to start to understand that particular aspect of color management. So absolutely, because we're talking about a more subtractive medium where light is going through something to create a color versus a display which is producing a color on its own, that has different physical properties. So definitely worth highlighting and mentioning that you need to think about that process when it comes to understanding that value of color. Yes.
Thank you. I truly enjoyed your presentation. You indicated that there is no right or wrong way to manage color, and I understand your sentiments there, since we are human beings, so I take it from that perspective. But are there no metrics that one can count on most of the time that scientists can use to say this is working beautifully or not? And I also like to know, what could we take from your presentation that will help individuals who have to give out an award? What does one go on?
Sure. So I think there might be two aspects to that. From the technical perspective, that's the part where I mentioned the charts and validation. I think that's the technical perspective of correctness, meaning is that light, is that color that I was intending as a creative being properly distributed to others so that what I'm wanting to see is there. And that's where those metrics come into play. So can you look at those data values on a analytic diagram and say, yes, this is the right data, and then can I measure that data? Can I measure that with a colorimeter or some other color measurement device to say, okay, yes, this is also the color I'm expecting to see. So those are some of those metrics when we talk about delta E and data analysis as to correctness of color. To the awards question, I don't know if I'm qualified enough to necessarily speak on that, but I think it's important to consider the human aspect, right? When you're talking about whatever topic that may be going to, is it a technical thing, is it a creative thing, and at the end of the day, what's the impact on humanity and how we're interacting with media?
As we know, different cultures behave differently toward different colors.
Absolutely.
And that there are some cultures that as we know, simply cannot see different colors. So what are the intercultural implications for this science that is so fascinating?
Yeah, Just to touch highly on it, I know that we need to start getting to our next session here. Not shown here, but there is color research being done. I actually participated in a study in college of how do we talk about color in different cultures and how do we name color and communicate it. There's absolutely cultures that may not characterize or bucketize color in the same way and use the same words to describe them. And I think that's very interesting to see how that reflects in their art and what their creativity is, and something we should keep in mind as we're viewing art from different cultures and what perspective they're having and what their interpretation could be, and also from that what ours could be. And there's differences there, which I think is a beautiful part of humanity.
And it would have I must not let go of Genesis. And in the Bible, it says in the beginning, and God created light, he called it day, created night, he called it darkness. What do you want to do with this in your science?
I'm sorry, could you?
You say in Genesis, God said, let there be light, call the light day, and the darkness night, creating two colors, light and darkness. So, this is a whimsical kind of question, I want to say that, but I'm fascinated by this. What would you do with that question if it came from someone who really did believe dutifully and religiously in the Bible? What could you say to that person?
It's a very interesting question to ask a scientist. I don't know.
You don't have to answer. I just wanted to, it was just moving around in my head.
The thing that comes to my mind is just what the range is out there, and how color in different settings can have very different meanings. And being able to recognize that, interpret that in a certain way. I think the way that you choose to present color from a creative aspect, maybe this gets kind of to that answer of there's not a one-size-fits-all. If we're looking at something, you can have your own interpretation in whatever color palette there is, whether it's something that is lightness or darkness. I think that's where the creative aspects come into play. And my role as a color scientist is to allow people to have the tools to present that kind of expression.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you all so much. Let's go ahead and get into our next session. So I would like to introduce our next two panelists up to the stage. We have John Peterson and Grant Reynolds from Moonshine Production. Yes, please applause. These are two colorists from a local post house here in Atlanta. So let's have a little conversation with them to talk about their experiences in working in a color management environment and a creative color imaging system. All right, so let's go ahead and get into our next panel discussion. Excuse me while I put this microphone on. Oh, thank you so much. All right, so before we get into the technical details, first let's talk about who you are. So if each of you could take a moment to introduce yourselves and your backgrounds and how you got into this field.
Start. Yeah, I'm John Peterson. I am a colorist and fortunate enough to have a post house here in Atlanta called Moonshine Post. Established that 10 years ago with my founder, Drew Sawyer. And I'm happy to have many moonshiners in here with me and Grant as well. So colorist by trade, been doing it for 3 decades now. Started in Chicago, been in Atlanta for 20 years, worked in telecine film side for a good 10 years here. And now embracing this digital world. I scan my millions of feet of film, but now quite happy with all the digital technology, bringing beautiful images to my suite. And that's basically me, co-founder, partner, colorist, Moonshine. And then here is.
My name is Grant Reynolds. I started, like most people, in post-production in the dailies world. I was a dailies colorist when I first started. I have since moved on to finishing color. We finish titles in Dolby Vision and HDR for all the major studios and things like that. But I've been in Moonshine for 5 years yesterday, so that was a thing.
Thank you both for your introductions. Just to learn a little bit more about you before we get into the technical details, what got you into this field as a colorist?
I'll start that one. I played guitar for a living for a very long time, and I think that the marriage of that side of the brain to what we do now and what I do now is very closely linked. So that was sort of a linear transition for me. And when I started in this field, I was enamored with the creative look side of things and how the feel is presented by the color palette. So any sort of narrative, anything like that is driven by the visual. So that really enamored me when I first got into it. And of course I was desperate to learn, how do you achieve that look? It doesn't come out of camera looking like that, obviously. So that was, to me, the driving force. And how do I achieve that look? How do I achieve that feel? And the creative aspect of that was a real driving factor.
Yeah, so myself, as a young kid, I always had cameras. I had every little camera that came out. I still have my Canon AE1, would shoot film, but all through my youth in the 80s, I was always the kid at the party with the camera shooting pictures of my friends. I enjoyed that, but wasn't necessarily where I was going to go with anything. I was more a technical geek. I talked to Catherine. I was going down the engineering path. I loved circuit board, circuitry. I loved the smell of solder. I loved getting in there doing silly things like that. But fortunately, I had a sister who was 10 years older than me who worked in Chicago, and she was a creative. And I would visit her, and I would see incredible equipment, see the accounts she was working on. This was ad work back in the day. And it really got me interested in a different path instead of sitting on a circuit board and interacting with clients and such. I enjoyed. So I got my start in Chicago in a large post house. We had 80 some employees and many divisions. But I did what I thought I needed to do, and I started at the very beginning in trafficking, shipping, and handling, and worked my way through that. I became a duplicator. I made hundreds and hundreds of tapes. And thank you, SMPTE, for your color bars, by the way. I got to say that because these color bars mean a lot to me. Every tape that went out had to be checked against house bars, and you had to make sure things were technically correct before it went anywhere. So I did that for quite a while. Got involved with the editorial side of things on Avid. But then one day, these guys that were always in the dark room scanning film, doing their thing, they came to me and they needed a new assistant. They asked if I wanted to join the dark side, just like that. And it was kind of fun at the moment. And yeah, I do. So I got involved on telecine and assisting. And assisting really, as an assistant back in the day, you really had a role. You were threading machinery. You were setting it up for your colorist, your operator to take it, to have a solid session with the clients. And part of my role also was interacting with the clients. It's a very important thing. Lunch, I became a DJ. It was a big thing to spin music. We didn't have internet. So I learned all these client roles, how to make a client comfortable in a session and make the session move. Well, little did I know that was going to continue to be a key part of how I grew in this industry. I came to Atlanta at the Film Lab, Cinefilm, now Kodak, many solid years there. But when they closed, my business partner, Drew Sawyer, had come to me with a TV series, and I had no place to work. So we bought the digital assets from the lab. We began Moonshine in 2013, and we've been going strong ever since. I think we have 15, 16 employees now. We have a new home in Glenwood Park, and we're really happy over there. So Moonshine's where I'm at and plan to stay.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I have to say, from a personal perspective, I'm really grateful that you guys are here today. And it's been very fascinating to watch the interactions, especially with our speakers yesterday, and seeing the interrelationships that exist. So I think it's really awesome to be able to highlight the creativity and the technicalities that are going on here in Atlanta. I think when people are still thinking of film and where the hubs are, they're thinking of LA and Hollywood. I think it's awesome to highlight that for you guys here in the Atlanta area. Yeah. So maybe to touch on, because we were asked about in the last session, could you speak a little bit about your film background and what those either creative or technical experiences were in scanning film and working from the perspective?
On my film years, it was very technical. I had some really cool accounts. I was a worked with the NASA team. I did a lot of high-speed engineering films. So we'd shoot 400 frames a second on a variety of things. I worked with Lockheed Martin, checking engines and such, circuit boards, how things triggered. But it was very technical on the film side. I worked at the lab. It came right out of the processing tank. We would put it on a telecine and scan it. And at that day, it was all tape. We went to either 3/4 beta or D1 or D2 or something along those lines. So myself, as it came through the board, and again, your technical aspect is much appreciated. I am fortunate to have all the scientists create these incredible tools for me to work on. I just have to know how to operate my tools. So I'm given great software and hardware that work. And I thread film, and it comes in, and scopes, as you mentioned, scopes are my life. Reading scopes is everything I need to make a beautiful image. So I can look at my vector scope and know where I'm right or wrong on my waveforms. So on the film side, it was bringing something in, of course, removing the red base from everything, creating a good image. I will say slates on the beginning of a production. You have your clapperboard with white and black on there. That is my reference for my white point and my black point. So you can create a lot of good images just by making your slate look good. And then you dial into it, and then you get into the real meat of the image. And that's where you need to know how to read a scope, where your values are, where you want to be on the image. And then you just kind of set it. And part of being successful in that is you always have a reference to go to. So I would constantly grab a reference. Still, we'll get into this later on, maybe some other questions, but that's always my guide. I have where I want to be for all the footage that's coming after my initial shot, and I match that. But yeah, it was in the film time. I was fortunate to work on some big dailies projects. Blindside is one that I was working on. We Are Marshall, some really decent films there. But the engineering side and working with NASA was great. I did numerous missions for the space station, or the shuttle launches. And it was all engineering, 400 frames a second, like I said. So we could sit and analyze to make sure that once the shuttle left the pad, none of the umbilical cords hit or did any damage to it. So we had a 24-hour window to evaluate thousands of feet of film with NASA engineers behind me looking frame by frame at 400 frames a second, 38 different cameras, all shot on 16, fired at the same time. You can find the same frame on every different angle. And it was a lot of analyzation and checking that out for safety reasons. I can go on about my film days. I've seen so many different projects I've enjoyed over the year. I've been thrilled to be involved with. But it was the technology is already there. I'm using a Spirit box that is engineered to a T. I just have to be an operator that knows the tools I have and what my output needs to be, which goes to your displays. Very important part. We'll get more into that because Grant will talk displays greatly. But yeah, on the film years, I enjoy that. I said when I did film, I was it was a physical process. I was up physically threading film. I was actually in pretty good shape there. Now I sit here, I got terabytes at my fingertips. I don't have to go anywhere. I have feature films and series sitting on 2 petabytes of storage in the facility. So I just sit there and I have my panels and my suite that I'm very comfortable in. And I work in that on a daily basis. So that's where I am now. So I hope I answered that.
Yeah, thank you. And I think you provided my segue. I was going to ask for the digital technical perspective. And I want you to just talk a little bit about maybe how that has evolved over the past few years, or what are those aspects that you're using in your daily work?
So the camera codec and the camera bodies themselves will always outstrip the media that is needed to process it. So if you take the evolution of the Sony Venice, for example, and we'll just take that because Christian kind of touched on that yesterday a little bit. We talked about the Sony Venice and the 6K capture in 2018 to now the Sony Venice 2 body now that will capture 8K, right? And those codecs have evolved to the point where they're capturing wider gamuts of color. S-Log 3 is more efficient than it ever has been. And in the digital realm, I think the goal, at least now, and the trend now, is to always get as close to a film print as we can, right? So that's the biggest thing. And that's what I've seen. And as far as transforms and things like that are concerned, making sure that that pipeline is intact so we can present that in a display referred situation from scene referred to display referred. We try to maintain that pipeline as cleanly as we possibly can. So from capture all the way to presentation, we're trying to maintain a clean pipeline. Hopefully that's on the realm of answering your question. But all of the camera mediums have evolved, and they evolve quickly. So if we look at 2018 to now, we're looking at a 6-year time gap where now almost everyone is shooting open gate if they're shooting on an Arri, or they're shooting wide open on a Venice, or they're shooting wide open on a Monstro 8K from Red. And to the color piece, all of those bodies capture color differently, and all of them represent color differently. Skin tone, any kind of other medium represent them differently. So it's our job to bring those into a common space and to make sure that those are represented accurately.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. I want to take a moment to highlight you used 2 words that has always, it was a great discussion that we were having in our color management working group of scene referred and display referred. I think that's a great creative representation I think that people are using, as opposed to the technical terms we were introducing before about OETF, EOTF. So when you hear something that's scene referred, I want you to think about those linear light principles and talking about what color was coming from an object. And then we're talking display referred, what is that color that's showing up in that final stage? Those have very different meanings. And I think sometimes people get confused a little bit when we start throwing these words around, and that goes to we want to make sure we're all speaking the same language and understand when we say scene referred and I say OETF, what that means. Or if I say linear, I think that's really what
those are interchangeable ways to say the same thing.
Yes, exactly. And that's where a lot of confusion, I think, comes in color management. People will hear a lot of these phrases and see these charts and they think, oh, this feels really complicated. But I think tools are developing a lot nowadays that are making it less complicated. So long as you understand some of those principles of where something came from and where it's going, it's becoming a lot easier, I think, for people to get a good pipeline and have a clean pipeline, as you were mentioning. To that extent, I think I want to ask both of you in your experiences, what evolutions in color technology, whether that's SDR, HDR workflows or display technology or camera technology, how has that affected your work over time?
The camera technology for sure affects our work because the camera technology, and I think it dovetails back to what we were saying before, that the cameras evolve faster than the machines that process them. Right. So if you look at, and I'm going to use Red as an example, a Red camera as an example, which is, I hope there's nobody that works for Red here, right? Sorry. Maybe not the most efficient codec to process. Okay. So maybe Red code is not the most efficient codec to process. That being said, any 8K capture might be tough in real-time playback. So that does affect us, not necessarily in the color pipeline, but in the online pipeline and things like that. That definitely affects us, and we have to have ways around that. Do we create proxies to do that? Do we work off of proxies until the final online, and our online artists have to deal with that headache, there in the end. I'm sorry, Ben. I'm sorry, man. But as far as the display technology, that is a really exciting thing because the limits of the displays that are coming out now and that are quote unquote affordable for a post house is pretty staggering, because you have displays that are capable of 4,000 nits now in a large area of their representation that was completely out of realm 5 years ago, right? So anything that can display a lot of Rec 2020 or 95 to 100% of P3 is within acquisition range of a post house, whereas 5 years ago, 6 years ago, Dolby was the only company that could actually have that, or larger post houses were the only ones that could really afford that. But now that technology is evolving to the point where it's more affordable for us to finish P3, for us to finish Rec 2020 and deliver Rec 2020, or finish Dolby Vision consistently. And so that, to me, that's the most exciting part.
What was the question again? I'm sorry.
How has evolutions in color technology, whether that's at the capture stage or the display stage, how has that changed
I think
your workflows?
he covered it all there, but the displays are key to me. The displays and scopes, as long as I have a good display to represent what I need. We're here in Atlanta. We support Flanders ourselves. There's other great ones out there, but that's what we have in our shop, and I love it. It gives me true representation of what I need. And then I have my scopes right next to me. He didn't touch on, but I use the Resolve scopes. He's got these scopes that he loves, his Omni scopes. So he's got his way, and in the end, they read and register what we want. He just has more tools on his that he really loves. So we work in tandem together, but we utilize different things at different times. But yeah, the technology, the displays have it just made my job so much easier. From the tube days with CRTs. The drift that would come from those on a regular basis, which nobody knows what a drift is right now in color temperature, but as that tube would heat up, your image could change throughout the course of a day. So as a telecine operator, I would scan film in the morning, put my look, and I'd go through 5,000 feet of film, and then I'd go to lay it off, and there would be a slight temperature change. I'd have to do a little offset because maybe something had changed. But nowadays you don't have that. You turn your monitor on, you give it 10, 15 minutes, 20 minutes, and it's going to stay consistent throughout the day. So that's awesome.
Wonderful. Touching a little bit, getting into what your daily work is like. So if I understand from your bios correctly, Grant, you're more on the daily side, or you
Both. That's where I started.
Gotcha.
So when I started, I was the dailies colorist in-house. I actually worked on Lovecraft Country, so Christian worked on that as well. But now since 2022, I've been full-time finishing.
Wonderful. Could you talk a little bit, both of you, about your process and like what goes into your beginning to end stages of finishing and coloring?
So the delivery aspect is always driven by creative intent of the project. If that's the director's vision, if that's the director of photography's vision, we try to adhere to that creative vision, whatever that may be. If that's a palette that's teal and orange, or if that's a palette that's skewed cyan, or whatever that may be, we try to stay consistent. But the representation, let me rephrase that. The correct representation of the human being is our number one priority. So however that is displayed, and within the creative intent as well, because like we said before, you touched on in your talk environmental aspects of things in a scene or in a situation. So all of those things bleed into one another. And we try to represent the director's vision, the director of photography's vision, and accurate representation of the human being at all costs in our daily work. Optimally, we like to be involved from the very beginning. So if we can get to the ground level with the director of photography, camera test, look tests right in the beginning to go ahead and develop a look for the show before it is shot, that's obviously an optimal situation. Does that happen? Not always. So we may come in on the end of it where we did not do dailies or we did not touch, the picture before, where we're just finishing. And so we have to deal with that on a different level. But like I said, optimally, we would be there from capture and acquisition all the way to delivery. But adhering to the DP and the director's vision is our number one priority.
Everything you said, but we also take it a little further with our post house. We have a full crew. So we begin at pre-production with my in-house producers, my online artists, ourselves. We are heavily involved in every project that comes through, just so nothing slips through the cracks, so that my online artists know what to expect at the end, where those delivery targets are. It's so important. Creative intent, where we're going. Shot deck is something that we always get references from, which is great. We create our own internal references, images that we're happy with. We keep them in a gallery that we can always call back on. So we have our process, but it's heavily involved with clients and discussion up front, from the camera package to what they're editing on, and to where the final point of distribution will be. So it is a process, but you get everybody involved for a smooth transition, and we've seen that work out favorable for us.
Awesome. So before we get into, I think, seeing some of your work here in your reel that you've shared with us, my last question I have there is, one of the things that I love about doing color correction. I thought that I was going to be an editor and I thought I was going to go into color correction, but then I got really interested in the math and science side and I stayed over in that lane. But something that I always found super fascinating is this translation and bridge between the creative aspects of doing coloring and the technical aspects. When you have someone who speaks a photographic language, how do you turn that into what you have to do technically to, as you say, right, create that vision? So can you talk a little about those conversations you have with your clients and how you go about bringing their vision to life using their language and maybe what that means for your tools that you're using?
Yeah, I often get we have instructions. We talk saturation overall globally of an image, where the film's going to live in a saturated level, heavy or low, or whether they're going to skew, as he said. Some terms that have come through on mine is, if we're looking at an image, myself, if somebody says the image looks milky, well, that just means we're a loss of contrast. And myself, that means lowering my black point a little bit to create that little depth in the image. So just being able to, I don't know, right now I don't have a lot more terms than that come up, but there are a variety of different languages that do come out, and it's just the interpretation at the moment. Again, we're looking at a display together as we're in the room, and ultimately, we're all trying to make a beautiful image, right? Environment, lighting, and all those will change, so we have to accept that mixed light may affect something throughout the process. We have great tools to do that. As far as my tools, I'm a Resolve guy. I've been operating Resolve forever. I believe, I love pulling keys because keys allow me to set certain scenes the way I want, but also then key individuals and pull them out so that I can control them as the lights pass or as the environment changes, as haze comes in and things like that. So, variety of tools that I have that certainly help me in that.
From my side of the house, the technical and the creative aspect are two completely different things. And one of the things that we've built in is a technical pass to bring everything into a common space. So especially when you have, pardon me, projects that are captured with primary, secondary, and tertiary cameras, tertiary camera may not match the primary and secondary. So you could be talking about two Venice bodies or two Monstro bodies that somebody shot tertiary with an iPhone, or tertiary with an FX3, or something of that medium, where you're not looking at like a 10-bit or 16-bit raw capture, you're looking at an 8-bit image, and you have to bring that into the right space. Does the client need to be involved in that? Absolutely not. Right, so that particular piece of it is the absolute technical side. We need to have that balanced and matched before we get into a situation with a client. What I hear, if I dovetail into the client side and the creative side, thing I hear the most often is, this needs to pop. What does that mean to everyone? That means something different to everybody, right? This red needs to pop. This green needs to pop. Cool. What hue of that is that needs to pop? And that's something that as colorists, when we sit in a client session, that we really have to be able to translate. And I think the more you do it, the better you get at it, right? And you can speak that client language, but ultimately, like we said before, the client's interpretation of what they want to see is our ultimate goal.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing those things. Let's go ahead and take a look at some of the work that you guys have done in your reel here. So let's see if I press the right buttons, will they go? Oh, thank you.
No one once told me you can't blame yourself for things that are out of your control.
Is that really how you feel?
Everybody, remain calm. I must tell you, this is an amazing and quite valuable film. This is really exciting.
Brilliant, honey.
No,
Sit down.
no, that's not the brilliant parts. Wondering how can I explain that?
Fear is a reaction. Courage is a decision.
I figured you were playing it cool.
No, I'm asking about this.
Don't be so close-minded.
This isn't the past. This is now. And we can change what happened.
We control our destiny.
Have you run away before?
Done, Lyle. Never got this far.
Let's not make a thing out of it, okay? They made a judgment. You have to do self-hard feelings.
Why don't you start with that? You have no appreciation for storytelling. What you're not going to do in this particular situation is make me smile.
If you want the chance to prove that everything that every asshole ever said about you was wrong, you got 2 minutes to lace up and join me outside.
Maybe it's been long enough. Maybe it's time to let go.
Always calling it time shoot.
Are you in love? A picture is harder than a bunch of.
And then these atriums.
You know, and I feel better.
You take that jack off, that is 82% alpaca.
Awesome.
Yes, please. To close out our session here, touching on the theme of our conference, one of the things that I really appreciated looking at your portfolio and representations in your work was the diverse projects that you've worked on. So could you touch a little bit about what that experience has been, especially based here in Atlanta? What have you experienced from a colorist perspective in working with diversity and representation?
Of course. Yeah, we're here in Atlanta. I came down 20 years ago, and I've loved it. A few years back, I was fortunate to see some Tyler Perry projects come through. Everybody fortunate to be able to work on that. One thing I always do is respect the flesh tones. It's important no matter who's on the screen. I mentioned this earlier. My scopes are my guide. My gallery is my reference. I use that. So if I'm in a project at the beginning to the end, I have a flesh tone from a character in the front, and all the way to the end, I make sure I match. A couple of shows that I've done recently, right now, my one that's out on Amazon is Maxine's Baby, the Tyler Perry documentary. Worked hand in hand with the directors on that. And the only aspect that Moonshine did on that was finishing, color finishing and mastering. And so to have them reach out to me when Tyler's a big player was very a proud moment for me. Another that you saw in there is the founders, 20 Pearls, the founders of Alpha Kappa Alpha at Howard University, I believe. Deb Draper, I've worked on her with some shorts. And she always loved what I did to the flesh tones and how I was gave true representation to that. So through my years, it's caring and making sure I'm not losing details. I'm not blowing things out, washing things out. I'm keeping true images across the board, and I've gained that, and folks see that in my work. So I'm very happy that that's been perceived and received, and allows me to keep touching a variety of elements. A lot of what you saw here, we tons of different genres, of course. So you didn't see too many theatrical pieces in there, more series and all. But it's really bottom line for me is talking with the clients, letting them know how much I'm invested in their project because I'm nothing without them, and that I'm going to bring something to the table on a creative level. The technology is great; it's all around. I have. Grant is my ace. He's my tech dude. I have others as well, but my performance is sitting at my console with my interface and putting it on the screen. That's where I do my thing.
JP said it well. I can't really add much to that other than I wanted to reiterate and kind of stand on what he was saying about image representation in our galleries and in our scopes. And always staying true to representing the human